"Dad, you don't need that mansion anymore. We'll help you sell it fast." That was the sentence that stopped my breath. I was pruning the lavender that morning, the October air cool on my face, when Lucas said it. My scissors slipped. The metal hit the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo inside my chest. "My name's Raymond. I'm 72, retired, and still learning how to live alone after losing Helen, my wife of 40 years. The house I live in isn't just a house, it's the place where we raised our kids, argued over bills, danced to old records, and sat by the window to watch the lake change colors with the seasons. To me, it's a memory made of walls. To them, maybe, it's just property." I looked at Lucas, his crisp shirt, his confident grin, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. When did my son start talking like a realtor instead of a son? When did love become something negotiable? "Lucas," I asked, keeping my voice steady, "what did you just say?" He smiled, polite, almost rehearsed. "I'm just thinking of you, Dad. The place is too big, hard to maintain." "Thinking of me," I repeated, "or thinking of your own balance sheet?" The silence that followed was heavy. Too heavy for two people who once built sandcastles together on the beach. I watched his eyes flicker away, and in that flicker, I caught the truth I didn't want to see. Maybe every family drama starts quietly. Not with shouting or betrayal, but with one small moment when love and self-interest brush shoulders. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start a story like this one. One that walks the fine line between care and cruelty, between memory and money. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. Because what happened next was the beginning of something I never saw coming. The house was unusually still that night, only the wind brushing against the windows and the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway broke the silence. I had just turned off the lamp when a sound reached my ears, low, deliberate, like someone whispering secrets into the dark. I stepped out of my room, the floorboards sighing beneath my feet. My heart thudded in rhythm with each step. From the end of the hallway, a faint glow seeped under the living room door. Then I heard it. Lucas's voice, quiet but clear enough to slice through me. "If Dad signs today, we can transfer the deed within the week." I froze. The words hung in the air like cold breath. The son I'd once carried on my shoulders was now discussing the house, our home, like a business deal. I pressed my palm against the wall, steadying myself as my stomach tightened. I pushed the door open just enough to see him. He was pacing by the window, phone in hand, speaking in that calm, confident tone I barely recognized. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Lucas," I said, "what exactly are you planning to do with this house?" He turned, startled, but not ashamed. "Dad, I'm just thinking ahead. You don't need to worry about all this. It's about securing the future." I stepped closer. "Whose future, Lucas? Yours or this family's?" He looked away, exhaling through his nose. That silence between us, that thick, uneasy quiet, said everything words couldn't. I walked back to my room, closing the door softly behind me. My hands trembled as I leaned against the wall, the same wall Helen once leaned on when she laughed about our leaky roof. "Home," she used to say, "is the one place where no one keeps score." But tonight, even the air inside these walls felt like it carried numbers, values, ownership, plans. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid of losing the house anymore. I was afraid of losing the people who once called me Dad. For 3 days, no one spoke to me, not a word. The house that once echoed with laughter and dinner chatter had fallen silent, as if even the walls were holding their breath. I'd pass Lucas in the hallway. He'd look at his phone instead of at me. Emily avoided my eyes altogether. One afternoon, I heard footsteps and voices downstairs. Strangers. I leaned over the stair railing and saw 2 men in suits walking through the living room, holding tablets and murmuring numbers. Lucas called them financial consultants, but I knew a sales pitch when I saw one. I made myself a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch. The morning light spilled across the garden Helen once tended. The lavender still bloomed, though a little wilder now, like it missed her hands. The scent was the same, rich and comforting, but the man holding the cup wasn't. Emily stepped out a few minutes later, her expression careful, her tone rehearsed. "Dad," she said, "you should come inside. They just need to check a few documents." I looked up at her, searching for the little girl who used to hide behind my chair whenever thunder struck. "Emily," I asked quietly, "do you really agree with your brother on this?" She hesitated, eyes flickering toward the house. "I just want things to be clear, Dad. Mom's gone. This house is too big." I smiled. Not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that comes from realizing you've lost something you can't name. "Too big," I said. "Or does your mother's memory make it feel too crowded?" Her lips parted as if to respond, but no sound came. She turned away, and I watched her walk back into the house where every corner still whispered Helen's name. For the first time, I felt like a ghost drifting through my own home. Invisible, unwanted, tolerated out of duty. And beneath that stillness, I sensed something darker. A quiet current of betrayal dressed up as practicality, and the faint trace of deceit lingering in every polite smile. When people forget the past, they're willing to sell their souls just to buy convenience. I called David Ross early that morning, my old friend, and once my lawyer back when contracts still made sense and people still meant what they said. My voice was low, half embarrassed, half suspicious. "David," I said, "I need you to take another look at the land records. Something doesn't feel right." He sighed, that familiar lawyer's sigh that says, "This will take a while, Ray." "Give me a few days," he said. "I'll dig through the archives." 3 days later, he showed up at my door, brushing dust from his coat, and carrying a folder so old it looked like it had survived a small war. He set it down on the kitchen table with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for funerals. "Ray," he said slowly, "do you remember the charity donation you and Helen made about 10 years ago?" I frowned. "Charity donation? We gave to the local orphanage. You handled the paperwork." He opened the folder. "Not that one. I mean the Green Trail Foundation." I stared at him, waiting for a punchline that never came. "David, what are you talking about?" He tapped the papers gently. "According to these, a significant portion of your land, the forest area behind the house, was transferred under Helen's name. And then 2 months later, she donated it to the foundation." For a moment, the room went silent except for the slow hum of the refrigerator. Then I laughed. A short, dry laugh that sounded like it came from someone else. "So, you're saying my wife secretly gave away half our property to save some trees?" David gave me that look, the one that said this wasn't a joke. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Well," I muttered, "at least she chose trees over financial consultants. Can't say I blame her." But deep down, my chest tightened. Helen had always been thoughtful, deliberate. She wouldn't have done this carelessly. Maybe she'd seen the cracks in our family long before I did. Maybe this was her way of protecting something. Not the land, but what it represented. David gathered his papers. "I'll make copies for you. You should keep them safe." When he left, I sat there, staring at the faint ring his coffee cup left on the table. The kind of mark Helen would have wiped away immediately. Now it just stayed there, like proof that nothing, not even the past, could be perfectly cleaned. Outside, the wind rustled through the remaining trees, and I thought I heard her voice in it, soft and knowing. Maybe she'd already prepared for this storm. Maybe this hidden clause wasn't betrayal at all, but a message. A quiet warning from a woman who loved me enough to plan beyond my understanding. And suddenly I wondered, had she left behind more than just a clause? I called them both over on a Sunday afternoon. The house felt smaller that day, or maybe I was just aware of how loud silence could be when you're waiting for a storm. Lucas arrived first, pacing before he even took his coat off. Emily followed, her arms crossed, eyes darting between us like she already knew something was wrong. I motioned for them to sit. My hands trembled slightly as I poured coffee for all three of us. The smell filled the room, warm, familiar, but it did nothing to soften what was coming. "Lucas, Emily," I began, "there's something you both need to know." Lucas looked up sharply. "You sound like you're about to tell us you're moving to Florida, Dad." He laughed, but it was hollow. I smiled faintly. "No, nothing like that. It's about the property, the land around the house." Emily frowned. "What about it?" I took a breath. "The land you've been talking about selling. It's not ours anymore." There was a pause, a small, stunned silence before Lucas barked a laugh. "What do you mean, not ours?" "I mean," I said slowly, "your mother donated it, back in 2014, to a conservation foundation." Emily blinked, confusion washing over her face. Lucas slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "You're kidding me. You're telling me Mom gave away half our inheritance and didn't tell anyone?" I met his eyes, his mother's eyes, but colder now. "No, Lucas. She didn't give it away. She preserved it. There's a difference." He stood, his voice rising. "So you just let her do it? You let her throw away our future?" I stayed seated. My voice was low, steady. "Your mother didn't throw anything away. She returned something she believed we'd borrowed. From the earth, from time itself." The room fell still again. Emily's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Lucas turned away, fists clenched. I could almost hear the sound of something breaking inside him. Pride, maybe, or the illusion of control. For a brief moment, I thought about Helen's quiet smile, the way she always saw beyond what others could. She must have known this moment would come. She must have known the truth would hurt before it could heal. Lucas finally muttered, "You've ruined everything, Dad." I looked at him, my son, my blood, and said softly, "No, son. Sometimes losing something is the only way to remember what's worth keeping." He didn't answer. He just left, slamming the door behind him. The sound lingered long after he was gone. Emily stayed behind, silent, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. I didn't say another word. Neither did she. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe not yet. A week passed. The house grew quieter, though silence had never felt so heavy. Even the ticking clock in the kitchen seemed unsure of itself, pausing now and then as if it too was holding its breath. That afternoon, a young woman arrived at my door. She introduced herself as Sarah Harper from Green Trail Foundation, the same organization Helen had worked with years ago. Her voice was calm, careful, the kind people use when they're about to deliver something that matters. "I have something for you, Raymond," she said, pulling a sealed envelope from her bag. My name was written across it in Helen's familiar looping hand. Below, a smaller line read, "To Raymond if they start to fight." My fingers trembled as I took it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Helen's handwriting, alive, graceful, felt like a voice from the next room. I sat down, the chair creaking beneath me, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. "If they begin to argue, remind them this house belongs to the one who guards memories, not the one who counts money. Signed, Helen." I must have read it a dozen times before I looked up. Sarah was watching me quietly, her hands folded in front of her. "There's more," she said softly. "Mrs. Brooks left a private instruction with Green Trail, a legal document, one that gives you the final say over who inherits the property." The words hit me like cold air. Helen had always planned ahead, but this was something else. A message from beyond, delivered at the exact moment when we were falling apart. That night, Lucas returned, still angry, but calmer. Emily was already there, her eyes red from crying. I handed her the letter, and she read it aloud. Her voice cracked halfway through. When she finished, she pressed it to her chest, as if holding her mother one last time. Lucas said nothing at first. He just stared at the letter, jaw tight, eyes shining. Finally, he whispered, "She knew, didn't she?" She knew we'd turn against each other. I nodded. Your mother always understood people better than they understood themselves. For a long time, no one spoke. Outside, dusk settled over the yard, painting everything gold and gray. I thought about the years we'd spent building this home. Laughter in the kitchen, Christmas lights that never worked right, the way Helen hummed while she cooked. All the things that made this house more than wood and walls. It struck me then that what we were living wasn't about property or legacy. It was something deeper. A quiet test of love and forgiveness inside this family drama we'd become. Helen hadn't left us instructions to control us. She'd left them to save us from the small, cruel edges of our own pride. Emily reached across the table, her hand finding mine. Lucas hesitated, then placed his on top. It wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was something close, a fragile truce, born from the ashes of misunderstanding and betrayal. I looked toward the window. The light had faded, but I could almost see her standing there, smiling the way she always did when the house finally felt like home again. Maybe Helen had never truly left. Maybe she'd just found a gentler way to teach us. One last time. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains like it was trying to soften what was about to happen. I called both Lucas and Emily to the kitchen. The coffee was still brewing when I spoke. You both want this house so badly, I said, my voice steady but low. Then earn it. Live here for 1 week. No phones, no internet, no running away. Just you, the house, and the quiet. If you can handle that, this place is yours. Lucas blinked at me as if I'd just suggested living on Mars. You're kidding, right? I'm not, I said, pouring my coffee. Think of it as an open book exam for your soul. Emily glanced at her brother, then back at me. And if we can't, then maybe it was never really yours to begin with. Lucas left without a word, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. I almost laughed. It was the kind of overreaction only youth and guilt can produce. Meanwhile, Emily stayed. She just sat there, silent, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. That night, I showed her how to start a fire in the old wood stove. She burned the first batch of logs. Smoke filled the kitchen, and we both coughed until our eyes watered. Then we laughed. It was the first real laugh in weeks, maybe months, the kind that makes you forget who was right and who was wrong. By the third day, she'd learned to listen, to the creak of the floorboards, to the sound of wind combing through the pines. I caught her standing outside at dawn, eyes closed, face tilted toward the cold air like she was hearing her mother's voice in the breeze. On the 5th day, she found Helen's old recipe box in a drawer. That night, she made the same pot roast her mother used to cook every Sunday. It was a little oversalted, but when the smell filled the kitchen, I almost forgot how broken we'd been. On the 7th morning, Lucas came back. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes heavy, but his anger had drained away. He walked in quietly, stood near the table, and finally said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I was scared. I thought I was losing everything." I looked at him for a long moment. "You only lose something when you forget why it mattered in the first place." He nodded, eyes glistening. For once, there was no fight left in him, just honesty. Outside, the forest swayed, and I could almost feel Helen's presence in the wind again. Soft, approving, amused. The kind of look she gave when she knew we were learning something the hard way. Maybe that was the secret of every home, every family drama. We rebuild what we've broken only when there's nothing left but love to start over with. That night, we didn't talk much. We just sat together by the fire. The house creaked around us, familiar and forgiving. Maybe the house didn't need a new owner at all. Maybe it just needed someone who remembered how to listen. The morning after Lucas returned, the air felt lighter, as if the house itself had exhaled. No one spoke about the argument, the documents, or the long nights of silence. Some things don't need to be dissected. They just need to be lived through. At breakfast, I poured coffee for the three of us. For a long time, we ate quietly. only the sound of forks and the ticking clock filling the space between us. Then I said, "If we're going to stay here, let's make this place ours again. Let's fix it, together, the way your mother would have wanted." Emily smiled softly, eyes glistening. Lucas hesitated, but eventually nodded. "All right, Dad, but don't blame me if I ruin the paint job." "Son," I said, handing him a brush, "after everything we've ruined already, a little bad paint won't hurt." We started with the living room. The walls had yellowed over the years, holding more memories than any of us could count. Emily chose a light cream color. "So it feels like morning," she said. Lucas dragged the ladder in, nearly knocking over a lamp, and cursed under his breath. I laughed. He did too. It was small, imperfect laughter, but it felt real. Outside, we cleared the yard. The flower beds Helen once tended were overgrown, the soil cracked and tired. Emily knelt to replant marigolds, Helen's favorite. Lucas dug beside her, sweating, muttering about blisters. Yet every shovelful of dirt seemed to bury a little more resentment, a little more pride. When we stopped for lunch, I caught sight of Helen's old straw hat hanging on the porch. The sunlight slipped through its frayed edges, scattering gold across the wooden steps. For a moment I could almost see her there, barefoot, smiling, reminding me that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, forgiving even when it hurts. As the days passed, the house began to change, but so did we. The cracks in the wall were patched, and so were the ones in our hearts. Lucas teased Emily less. Emily stopped walking on eggshells around him. And me, I stopped waiting for apologies that would never sound right. By the end of the week, the place smelled of fresh paint, earth, and coffee. The laughter returned, though quieter, humbler. We didn't erase what had happened. We built around it, the way one might build around a scar, acknowledging its place in the story. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't surrender. It's choosing peace over proof. And in a world obsessed with being right, that's the bravest thing one can do. When the evening light slipped through the window, painting our newly washed walls in gold, I thought I saw Helen's reflection in the glass. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Sometimes to win, you don't prove who's right. You just choose to love once more. 3 months later, the air around the house had settled. Softer, quieter, as if it finally understood that it no longer needed to fight to be heard. The scent of lavender returned to the porch, growing wild yet gentle, like time forgiving itself. I sat by the oak desk where Helen used to write her letters, the afternoon light brushing over the papers. My hands trembled slightly as I finished the new will. There were no numbers, no property lines, no cold divisions, just one simple line. "This home belongs to whoever remembers it with love." I read it aloud, and for the first time in years, my voice didn't echo back with loneliness. The house, the lake, the trees, they had all borne witness to our storms, our mistakes, and our silent reconciliations. What once was a battlefield of resentment now felt like a sanctuary. Funny how every family drama starts with ownership and ends with understanding. The irony stings, but it heals too. That evening, Lucas and Emily came over. No big announcements, no apologies rehearsed, just 2 grown children who finally looked at their father not as a gatekeeper, but as a man who had also learned to forgive. Lucas brought a box of old photos. Emily baked Helen's lemon pie, the one that never quite held its shape, but always tasted like comfort. We sat together on the porch, flipping through memories that were yellowed, torn, and perfect in their imperfection. "I still don't get how Mom kept all this organized," Emily laughed. "She didn't," I said. "She just remembered where love lived." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of pine and paint. I could almost hear Helen humming from the kitchen, her song dissolving into the air. Lucas looked at me and said quietly, "Dad, I was wrong." I smiled. So was I. That's how we get it right in the end. We didn't need grand closure. The house didn't either. It stood there, steady, aging, honest. A reminder that betrayal can't outlast forgiveness, and deceit can't survive where truth learns to breathe again. Later, I walked down to the lake. The sun was dipping low, turning the water to gold. For a fleeting second, I saw Helen's reflection beside mine, her hand almost touching mine in the glassy surface. "Maybe," I whispered. "Love never leaves. It just changes its address." A quiet chuckle escaped me, half joy, half ache. The house behind me glowed softly in the fading light, not a symbol of what we owned, but of what we had finally learned to cherish. The last rays disappeared behind the tree line, and I closed my eyes, letting the warmth linger a little longer than it should. Because home isn't where you stay. It's where your memories decide to rest. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Take care of your health, hold your loved ones close, and cherish every small piece of peace you can find. I'll see you in the next story, one that might start with loss, but ends, as always, with a heartbeat.